From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is Maureen Corrigan. I'm a book critic for the Washington Post and for Fresh Air. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. The Washington Post has been a sponsor of the festival since it began 13 years ago, so it's been a long time. Thank you. Today I have the really great pleasure of introducing to you Joyce Carol Oates, and I get to say something that I have never before said in all the years that I've been coming to the National Book Festival. Joyce Carol Oates is the author of at least 70 books. That's 70. That number includes novels, novellas, plays, collections of essays and criticism, and also collections of poetry and short stories. Of course, Joyce Carol Oates is not only a prolific writer, she's also a superb one. If I started to list all the awards that she gave, we'd be here until 7 o'clock at night. So I'll just pluck out the O. Henry Award, the National Book Award, and the National Humanities Award. That is a very select list. I also want to tell you that she's garnered great word-of-mouth praise. If you talk to independent booksellers, as I do, and to undergraduates in college, they all say when they hear the name Joyce Carol Oates that she is a delight, that she is down to earth, that she is kind, and that she's generous with her time. I know of at least 2 undergraduates who wrote to her out of the blue asking for writing advice, and she very kindly wrote them long letters back. That's unusual, let me tell you. Joyce Carol Oates seems to delight in mixing things up, in mixing genres and types of stories. She's said that each book that she writes is a world unto itself and must stand alone. In a review in the New York Times of her latest novel, The Accursed, Stephen King anointed that novel the world's first postmodern Gothic novel. He also went on to liken The Accursed to a cross between E.L. Doctorow's Ragtime and Dracula by Bram Stoker. If that doesn't whet your appetite, nothing will. In addition to The Accursed, Joyce Carol Oates also has recently published a collection of 4 novellas about love gone wrong called Evil Eye. Please join me in welcoming Joyce Carol Oates.
Well, thank you very much for the lovely introduction, very lively and spirited. I'm always very happy to be here in Washington, D.C. It's sort of like the center of all sorts of things, very exciting things, some of which one can actually speak about. My friends back home will be very impressed that I'm here and nothing, horrendous happened if I actually do get back. So I'm here to talk about my new novel, I think, and my new book of stories. And I was here a couple of years ago and was interviewed so wonderfully right on stage. And then we had questions from the audience that were just brilliant. So I'm wondering if there are any of these brilliant people are here this afternoon. And I could just sort of go immediately to these wonderful questions. But I'll start by talking a little bit about myself. I began writing a long, long time ago, before anyone here was born, I guess. It was sort of a time when you engraved on pieces of stone, with a sharp. Then my first quantum leap to another way of communication was when I was given a box of Crayolas. And this was like the great step, like Tolstoy was given a typewriter or something. So I was given these Crayolas. I could not yet read, and I suppose I jabbered in some way, in some sort of gibberish. I'm not sure that it was coherent, but I wasn't yet a literate person. I was a very small person at that point. So I was so excited about the idea. I think the Crayolas, maybe something about the hand-eye coordination, and the idea of commemorating and imitating the visual world. You know, children are drawing and they're sort of appropriating the world, that I started very extensively writing novels on tablets. I've seen these. They're quite bizarre. They should be in that strange museum in Philadelphia. I think it's called the Mutter Museum, where all these pathological things are, like these tablets, many, many tablets of scribbles, because I didn't know how to write yet. So they were like different colors, and they were very passionate. All the adjectives that are sort of given my writing by reviewers who are being kind, you know, passionate, vivid, and so forth. All those adjectives would accrue to these scribbles as well. I thought that was funny. It just actually seemed very pathetic and sort of funny. Then after a while, I'm not saying how many years this was, I learned to draw. So I could only draw two figures. One was cats, and the other was chickens. And you could actually not tell the difference between them too well. I thought maybe in some anthropomorphic way I was writing about people. So the cats are upright, and the chickens, I guess, are upright anyway. So they kind of cats and chickens. And then this continued for a long time, and we're really talking about the whole evolution, like of a Tolstoy here, you know, before he was even literate. So I guess the point that I'm making, and I'm sure everyone in the audience has experienced the same thing, is that we are all so mysteriously creative, and that it's the impact of the visual world and maybe the mysterious world of adults that we want to somehow put into a book and into our imagination. So somewhere along the line, then, I must have learned to actually read, and then I learned to write. And so I just sort of continued with that fervor. And I've always thought it was really interesting and mysterious that the roots of our creativity are so deep in us that they lie way before we have anything to say. Nothing to say. You know, I wasn't a feminist then. And people who are commercial writers who go on to become billionaires, it really begins at a time in their lives when they don't have any agenda, and one doesn't think of oneself as a writer in any way. So it's really amazing and very mysterious, I think, these roots and the deepest roots of our human unconsciousness and what is shared in us that's very hard to talk about. Then I went to a one-room schoolhouse. This is in upstate New York. We lived on a small farm, and it was not a very successful farm. I have still a sort of romantic predilection for the outdoors and for farmland, and I would love someday to have chickens again, but I can't think that really that way of life is easy. Hello, are you hearing that, or is that just in my head? I hear a voice that's telling me to do things. I have to be very careful. That's a little loud. Well, anyway. So I went to a one-room schoolhouse that my mother had gone to, and I learned to read. And I remember we had a small library that was really just like a windowsill, and we had books on the windowsill. In my family home in the farmhouse, we didn't have any books at all. I think maybe just one book. It was the book, the short stories of Edgar Allan Poe. So when I was at school, I really was introduced to the world of books, and I think because books were so rare in my life that they assumed a high value. Now, if you contrast with today, with a young person today, it's so radically different. There's hardly any comparison. As I came from this world where my parents did listen to the radio, but there was no television. And of course, there's nothing like the electronic ways of communication that we have today. So I was thrown back very much upon my own imagination. And with the Crayolas and the coloring books and drawings and telling stories, I really was creating little worlds of my own. later on, when I went to college, I would read about the Bronte sisters, the Brontes and the sisters and their brother, and you know that they grew up in extremely imaginative and emotional and economically deprived childhood in the moors of northern England. And because they had very little else, they had to rely upon their own storytelling. And they made up these little books in a small italic language, which one can read, I think, with a magnifying glass. And out of that, as years went by, out of that really grew the great novels, Wuthering Heights, and I'm sorry, I'm so distracted by that sound there, and Jane Eyre. So maybe I'll just sort of open it up to some questions in a few minutes. The novel that I have most recently published is called The Accursed, and it's the last in a series of postmodernist Gothic novels. I began with Bellefleur, which is a family novel, a kind of epic tragedy of American life. And Bellefleur was published in the 1980s. Then the second in the series is A Bloodsmoor Romance, and this novel draws upon women's writing romances of the 19th century. And I'm looking upon American inventions, small-town inventors in America, and looking upon the rise of women's suffrage and the male-female relations. It's sort of like a feminist look back at the 19th century. It's called A Bloodsmoor Romance. And then Mysteries of Winterturn was my favorite in the series. It's a collection of 3 mysteries. The first mystery takes place when the young detective is only a teenager, and then he's in his 20s, and then finally he's in his late 30s. It's a way of looking at American jurisprudence, criminal justice, and unsolved American mysteries. I chose 3 sort of iconic American mysteries. One of them was the Lizzie Borden case, which was adjudicated, but in many respects it was never really solved. And the other was a murder case that took place in New Brunswick. It's known as The Minister and the Choir Singer, and it was thought that probably the Ku Klux Klan had something to do with these murders. And the final mystery that I wrote about is based upon the Leo Frank assassination or lynching, and again, it draws upon the early history of the Ku Klux Klan. So I'd look upon the novels as means of investigating American history, especially areas of history that haven't been completely solved, where there's some area of mystery. I've also written about a couple of other mysteries. It just occurred to me that I had been fascinated by the JonBenet Ramsey case, which for a long time it seems not to be solved. Some people think it's been solved, and some people are sure that it hasn't been. So I wrote about that in a novel later called My Sister, My Love. And I think that for all of us who are writers or interested in American history, that to look upon something that's never been solved and remains controversial, where you can do some research and find different points of view, I think it's a very exciting and legitimate area for investigation. And then you can use your imagination to suggest a kind of solution. Then my most recent novel is called The Accursed. I finished this in an early draft. It was actually complete in 1984, and so it was only published in 2013, which is really a long time later. When I finished it in 1984, I was living in Princeton, and when I moved to Princeton, I became very fascinated by the history of that area. It's a very historically rich area in Princeton, New Jersey, and Trenton, and that part of Pennsylvania, and that sort of part of the United States. The history is very particularly interesting for those who have a particular concern with women's rights with male-female relations or female-male relations, and with racial, the evolution of race relations in the United States. And again, the Ku Klux Klan has a role in the novel, the rise of the Klan in the early years of the 20th century, particularly in South Jersey. So that novel actually begins with, in the aftermath, like it's like a day after a lynching has taken place, some miles, maybe only about 50 miles away from Princeton, New Jersey, and the concern of the people in Princeton is not to talk about it, that they go to great lengths to sort of pretend that they don't know about it and they haven't heard about it, and they particularly don't want to talk about it. So when I finished writing this in 1984, I usually put a manuscript away for some months, sometimes a year, and then I take it out again and reread it and edit it, and often I rewrite it. So when I was done with it, I wasn't really satisfied with the voice, and I put it away. But unfortunately, years went by, and I would go in the room and look at the manuscript, which, if you know New Jersey, it's a very humid state, so the manuscript is getting more and more moldy, and kind of, I felt really like going through a swamp, and there is actually a sort of swamp in the novel. So years went by, and I would start a few pages and try to fix up the voice, and then I'd give up again. If anyone in the audience is a writer, you know, there's sort of a wave of something like paralysis that comes over you when you don't have the voice and you don't have the emotion. It's like you've been trying to flick a match, to light a match, but it just doesn't work. So years went by, and then finally in 2011, and this is after the election, of course, of President Obama, because the novel is about race relations, and it is about the rise of the Klan and dealing with the Klan and trying to not notice that the Klan is there. And the novel is also about sort of the rise of labor unions and the rise of women's rights. So it's about a time in our history in 1905, 06, when a lot of things were going on. And so like 100 years later, it was really time to look back upon that, and I felt in 2011 that I could rewrite the novel, which I did. I had also read a wonderful book. It's partly theological and historical book, but also a memoir by James Cone, C-O-N-E. He's a black liberation theologist. He teaches at Union Theological Seminary, and he wrote this wonderful book. It's called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And I heard James Cone talk about his book and his personal experience. He is a minister. And it sort of gave me just the key to rewriting my novel, which had just been in this manuscript state for like 15 years or so, to look upon it as a way of examining the white guilt and the white consciousness that in some characters in the novel finally comes to fruition, that there are heroic characters in the novel. Also at this book festival, I think it was yesterday, Scott Berg was talking about Woodrow Wilson. He has a new biography of Woodrow Wilson. In my novel, Woodrow Wilson is a principal character. He's the president of Princeton University at the time, and I had read a lot of biographies of Wilson and took notes on his letters. He has many, many collected letters. And I think that my portrait of Woodrow Wilson is probably a little more acerbic than Scott Berg's, but I was happy to see that Scott Berg saw in Wilson the same sort of the white racist, sort of Virginian gentleman racism that Woodrow Wilson promulgated, and also his disinterest or his lack of interest or his derision in regard to women's rights. Then another character in my novel is actually Teddy Roosevelt, and this is a portrait of a person who is a president. He's president at the time. And these portraits of the presidents are not really exaggerated. It seems when you people have said reading the novel, you know, have you exaggerated or satirized these people? No, not really. They were quite strong characters. Jack London is in my novel also, and he too is an extremely strong and vivid character. And people think that maybe it's a satirical portrait, but it isn't. He was really that way. And Upton Sinclair, the socialist who wrote The Jungle, is another character in the novel. Upton Sinclair had rented a house just close by where I live today. Even now, I drive along Rosedale Road past the old Upton Sinclair house. And another portrait, just a cameo portrait of a person who drops by in a novel, is Sherlock Holmes. He's the model, the man who was the model for Sherlock Holmes, not the actual Sherlock Holmes, who's a fictitious character, but this person who is the real model. So finally, I did finish that novel. I changed the title from the Crosswicks Horror was the original title, and it's changed to The Accursed. Those of you who are familiar with L.P. Lovecraft know that Lovecraft has a work called The Dunwich Horror, and my novel was kind of an allusion to H.P. Lovecraft. So I'm wondering if people would like to ask questions. I'd be happy to try to answer any that you might have.
Here.
Yes. Yes, sir.
Hi. As an American writer, do you ever have any concern that modern literature and all the classics will eventually have to be rewritten so that in order to be understood, every fifth word will have to be the word like?
Is that a question? Is that a question about, quote, declining literacy or, yeah. Well, I think there's a difference between oral speech and written speech, and probably our ancestors had ways of speaking that were not so articulate. You know, when people are speaking, there are little words that you say, and all languages have them. I mean, Chinese, let's say, has some little word, Korean has some little word. We might say, you know, and our contemporary younger people might say like. I notice my students will say like, you know, like 15 times in a sentence. I think it's a kind of modesty, a sort of linguistic modesty. The word well, you say well, comma, well, how are you? The word well is just an empty sound, but it's some sort of linguistic, meta-linguistic way of connecting with people. So when people say like, when young people say like repeatedly, they're communicating in a meta-linguistic way with one another. So a person who doesn't say any of these things, who doesn't ever say you know or well or like, almost seems like a robot who doesn't have the idiomatic ease of ordinary speech. But there is a big difference between speech as we speak it and speech as we might write it. Written language can be enormously complicated, very, very complicated, long sentences and interesting punctuation, and a kind of experimental style that James Joyce has, for instance, or William Faulkner, just really very, very fluid. But nobody speaks that way. It would seem to be almost a psychopathological state if you spoke that way. It's a good question. Thank you. Oh, yes. Yes.
It's a pleasure to meet you. I've been reading you for about 25 years, since I've been in high school. And one of the very first stories I read was Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been? And it was my sort of introduction to a new type of feminine voice. But I would love for you to comment on why the subject of female maturation is so important to you, and your particular take on the story of a woman coming out and having her first sexual experiences or experiences with men, and where does that come from within you that drives you to write such amazing stories that I think many women, when they're 15, 16, sort of latch on to?
Well, thank you. It's a kind of complex question that you've asked with lots of sub-questions. Well, I think as a woman writer, or a writer who happens to be a woman, that I'm just interested so much in the period of adolescence. And I've written about adolescent boys, too. There's something about adolescence that is fascinating. Because when we use the adjective adolescent in a pejorative way often, you say you're behaving in adolescent fashion. But actually, adolescence is a very positive time because adolescents are asserting themselves as individuals vis-a-vis a family or parents, and they're often very skeptical and questioning. My students at Princeton are older adolescents, you might say, and they are very funny. You know, one of the qualities of teenagers is that they're funny. Of course, you don't think they're funny because they're maybe laughing at you, but, or, you know, laughing at adults. But they have this kind of world of discerning truth and sort of looking through hypocrisy that I think is very positive. So that's one of the reasons I write about people at that age, and also it's a time of sexual crisis and anxiety and not knowing who one is and so forth. Then that particular story has a particular genesis. Where are you going? Where have you been? I was literally looking through Life magazine a long time ago when I was in Detroit, Michigan. And I can remember exactly where I was. I was in a teacher's lounge at the University of Detroit. And I was just sort of looking through this magazine. I wasn't really reading it. I was turning the pages. And there was an article in there called The Pied Piper of Tucson, which was about a man in about 31 or 32 who disguised himself as a teenager. He tried to pass himself off as much younger in the teenage culture, and he was seducing and murdering girls in the Tucson area with the connivance of other teenagers and burying their bodies out in the desert. And when this came to light, when it was revealed what was going on, what was shocking was that the young people had a kind of allegiance to him. They didn't tell their parents. They were involved. It's sort of a pre-Charles Manson situation. This is so long ago that the term serial killer didn't exist. Now you know every third person you meet is a serial killer. I mean, maybe I should say on television. Every third person. But the term serial killer has now become just so popular that's almost too familiar. But when I began writing about this, there was no term like that. So I thought I'd write a story about a girl who is caught up in this chaos, which is sort of moral confusion. Like, do you have a moral commitment to your family, to your parents, or do you have a moral commitment to your peers, to people your own age? And I called the story Death and the Maiden. And it was definitely a Hawthornian morality tale, an allegory that Nathaniel Hawthorne certainly had influenced. But unlike Hawthorne's writing, I wanted my writing to be very much in the vernacular and very ordinary daily life, nothing that was abstract or obviously allegorical. And some of you may know there are German woodcuts or medieval woodcuts of Death and the Maiden, where there's a beautiful young girl looking in the mirror. She's got long hair and she's very innocent and naive. And in the background, Death is standing. It's Death with his scythe. And he's standing there and he has a skull. And he's in the mirror, but she only sees her own face. We see him in the mirror, but she doesn't see him. So I called the story Death and the Maiden, and then after a while I thought I would change it and make it less obviously an allegorical story. So I called it Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? So that's a long answer to you.
It's been a great story. Thank you for
Thank you.
writing it.
Thank you. Yes.
Hello, it's very nice to meet you. So often our lives and art are inextricably tied. And I wonder, Miss Oates, have you had any revelations lately?
Any revelation of what?
About life.
Revelation about life? Well, I think if one is on Twitter, one does it all the time, you know. It's just, there it is, like every little tweet is a revelation. Yeah, I think that I've had a lot of revelations about life. I think that, maybe speaking for some people in the audience, that the older you get, the more mysterious life is, and the more you're surprised by more things, but then you're not surprised that you're surprised, if that makes sense. But I think when you're younger, you don't have quite the capacity to guess what's coming. So there may be almost a complacence or a confidence. When I was a young writer, really new young writer with like one book just coming out, I somehow had more strange confidence than I do later. Now when I write, I think, oh, this has to be so original. Maybe I did this before, or I want to do something I've never done before. I want to have sentences that I've never written before, and I want a point of view I've never had before. But when you're only 21, you haven't done anything yet, so everything is new and original. So as you get older, I think the revelation is that things become ever more challenging and exciting. At the same time, you feel that something really disastrous can happen tomorrow. And then when it happens, you think, well, I knew this was coming. It's a little bit like what they say in boxing. I once wrote a book on boxing that came out in 1987. It's had other editions. So I've been writing about boxing for many, many years. Those of you who are interested in boxing know they say that the punch that knocks you out is the one you don't see coming. See, really good boxers are watching the opponent's hands, you know, and that sometimes they're moving so fast that with a jab here that direct the attention to this, and then they come around with a left hook or something, and the person's knocked out. And those blows, the boxers never see coming until they see the film or the video. They see the video, what happened to them, but they didn't understand that at the time because it happened so fast, especially when a boxer was really fast, like Muhammad Ali. So I think that's probably something that you learn as you get older, that the anxieties that you anticipate don't happen. You're worried about something over here, but what will really happen is something that comes through the periphery of your vision and you never anticipate. And therefore, there's no way to prepare for it. So there's no point in being anxious about anything. Yes, sir.
I think it's fair to say that Princeton is a community that has a very high self-regard. And
Princeton has high self-regard. That's a tweet. Good.
And yet your portrait of the community in the Accursed...
Pardon me?
Your portrait
Yes.
of the community in the Accursed is far from flattering. And so I'm wondering if you had an intention in writing the novel to put forward a revisionist picture of that community. And also I'm wondering what the reaction was among your colleagues at the university or in the community. Did they embrace this critical view of their community and its characters, such as Woodrow Wilson?
Woodrow Wilson. That's a good question. I'm assuming most people haven't read the novel, so I'll just talk a little bit about it. But the portrait of Princeton was meant to be actually a portrait of pretty much America at that time. White, upper middle class, affluent America. It could be it could be Boston, let's say, but it was Princeton since I knew that. 1905-06, that's pre-World War I, pre-Depression, pre-World War II. So it's a long time ago. The Princeton that exists now is very different from that Princeton. Some of the same old houses are there. The big old wealthy houses are still there. The names of the streets and the avenues and the names of the houses and the names of the university buildings are still there. So it's like it's preserved, but there's a new Princeton. There's a new Princeton. Because I was mentioning a few minutes ago that it was a time of racism. White people, like 99% of white people, thought that they were in every way superior to Negroes. Negroes were their servants or their slaves. They didn't question this, and they didn't think that they were evil for thinking it. They just assumed that the way. When Woodrow Wilson became president of the United States some years later, he actually took for granted that there were two races, and the white majority superior race, and then the sort of servile race of ex-slaves. So none of that is relevant in Princeton today. It's a really different community. Therefore, nobody that I ran into, and certainly not my colleagues or friends, would challenge me on that. But I wouldn't meet these people, and these are the people who wouldn't meet me, so I don't know what they're saying. Also, the focus on women's rights. See, in the 19th century and up until relatively recent decades, even into the 1950s, to be female was to be an aberrant specimen, because the male was the male was the norm. So if you were a medical person writing about medical theory and writing about science, or writing about psychology, it was always the male model. And then the female was this sort of strange, aberrant, maimed, castrated version of the male. So I'm certainly writing about that. And what else did you say? There was some interesting other question that you asked. Some other sub-question that was...
Did you intend to revise?
To revise, yes. Yes, I was looking at Woodrow Wilson and other people with unsentimental eyes. And nothing in the novel except the demons is really invented. I mean, everything, the kind of crazy, sexist and racist things that people say in the novel, they really did say. Some of the lines I took from Woodrow Wilson's letters. And he did really say things like that. But Princeton University today is a completely diverse university. We have every ethnic type, every skin tone, color. We've had remarkable presidents. We've had our first woman president at a university where Woodrow Wilson would have fainted at the idea of a woman president. He would have just thought that was literally obscene. He was making jokes about women that I don't think are funny at all. And he had a lot of pickaninny jokes, little black boys. So his humor was a sort of thing that today would just be considered really politically incorrect. Thank you. Yes.
Hi. You mentioned that you always set your novels aside after writing a draft for a number of months, and I was just wondering whether that's something that you've always done or whether that's developed over time. And I guess just if you might talk about what happens during that time between putting it aside and picking it back up again.
Are you a writer?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, it's very important that you have a cooling off period. You get so excited writing, it's very thrilling, and there's a sort of adrenaline rush. And it's really very, very thrilling, but I think you need the critical response to your own writing can only come a little later. If you read it the next morning, you're still in that kind of cocoon of excitement. So I will put the manuscripts away for a few months and then look at them again, and in between I've done other things. I like to do book reviews. I love writing book reviews, and I love to read sympathetic and intelligent book reviews. So that's a nice contrast to writing fiction. There was a novel of mine called The Gravedigger's Daughter that I put away for 2 years. 2 years. I was maybe a little afraid to publish that. I couldn't write that until after my parents had died. I guess I felt I shouldn't. But they did. My parents died, but I still didn't bring that. I didn't bring that out of the drawer for a while. Then I would sort of lie in bed thinking, what if I die now? Writers are so self-absorbed and narcissistic, I guess. You always think, you think, I'm going to die before I finish this. But then when you're all done, you think that, oh, no, I'm so sad and I'm lonely and melancholy, and I miss my novel. First, you're miserable and excited and anxious because you're sure you're going to die before you finish it. But then when you finish it, the next week, you're really lonely and melancholy and just wish that you miss your anxiety. And life gets so easy after that. So I would bring the novel out finally and published it. I have short stories that are published in magazines. Like I also have another book right around now called Evil Eye, which is 4 novellas. And those are actually long stories. I think somebody got the idea of calling them novellas. It sounds more classy. They're long stories. And not short stories, but somewhat long stories, like 35, 40 pages. Those stories come out in magazines, or literary magazines, or like the New Yorker or Harper's or whatever, so that you open it and you read it as a reader, and you see your story in columns of print, and that's very educational. You read your own story, and you think, well, this is too long here, or I need something more, this is too sketchy. So that's like a second reading and editing when you see it in print. And then you bring it into hardcover. So my hardcover books always have material different from the magazines. I always change them, and I consider that very important. So all this suggests a period of time that you don't get with tweeting. See, with tweeting is instantaneous and fleeting and transient, but writing is something that has claims to be more permanent and takes more time. Thank you.
Thanks to a cleverly written interview with you published in the book that advertised, or the publication that advertised this festival.
Oh, yes, my self-interview.
I know if I run into you in the grocery store, not to say, are you I won't do that.
Yeah.
So my question is, do you feel like you're two different people when you're shopping? Do you totally lie the writer aside? I ask that because I feel like the writing thing is a very powerful thing. Once you get into several books, there's an expectation. This isn't just writing. This is Joyce Carol Oates writing, and it better be that thing instead of just anybody writing. And so I'm curious about that part. Are you a person writing, or are you now that character that you've sort of created as the writer?
Well, that's a very profound question. It seems like a philosophical question, like Philosophy 500 or something. Well, all of you in the room have identities that are not your full identity. Some of you, you're all children, you're daughters or sons of somebody. You're probably brothers or sisters or fathers or mothers. And you have all these roles, and some of us are teachers or professors, and some of us are writers. And these roles that we have come together in a way to create an identity. But if you didn't have any of those roles at all, and you were just sort of backpacking in the Yukon, you would probably have an identity that was more your own complete essence. You know, like you're nobody's son and nobody's brother and nobody's father, and you're not teaching and your students don't know where you are, you know. And you'd be all alone camping out. So what would that personality be? That would be your personality, probably, if nobody was with you. But we almost never are in situations like that. We almost never go away. And when people go backpacking or camping, they often go with another person. So the expectation that there's another person there always draws out of you a social self that could be quasi-hypocritical, quasi-sincere, but it's not your essence. That's why the religious mystics and holy men and women of tradition would go away by themselves. And they would fast and be alone. And some of them swore to silence. They took, like Trappist monks, took vows of silence. They didn't talk to one another. And so they were trying to find the essence. I have to say that if I were all alone and couldn't talk to anybody and couldn't do my Twitter and couldn't take care of my husband, who many wives will agree a husband takes a lot of care. If I couldn't do all those things, I'm not sure who I would be. But when I'm alone with my writing, especially if it's uninterrupted, there comes to be a sense of a personality that's a little deeper than the surface. You know, it may not be the deepest. It may not be like Thomas Merton in his Seven-Story Mountain, the mystic. It may not be that deep, but it is a deeper self than just the social self. Thank you. Yes, yes.
The first thing that I wanted to say is it's not really a question. I write poetry, and I like when people come up to me and talk to me about how their poems meant something to them. And I met my second husband in a book club because of We Were the Mulvaneys. And it was very interesting that the ending threw so many people off in the book club. And that's how we sort of got together. It was a book club for separated and divorced people. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And,
Oh, that's interesting.
And thank you. The
Yeah.
second thing is the novella, I think, that you wrote about Mark Twain and
Yes.
the daughters. Now this is my real question. That was just my kind of intro comment. That really has stayed with me. I have not been able to read Mark Twain since I read that.
Yeah.
A really amazing short story. It touched on my personal history, which I don't want to go into, but it was very, very affecting and just really
Well, thank you.
fantastic. And I just wondered where did that come, a little bit.
Grandpa Clemens and the Angelfish. That's from reality. That's history. I did research into Mark Twain's his later years. So I've been told that I'm in overtime now, and that soon I'm going to be a drone is going to evaporate me. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.